Okay, we're going to episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff to have a really cool review for you guys from the brand Glycine. A little about them: they were founded back in 1914 and they are now owned by the Invicta Group. Their watches are Swiss made and they fall within that kind of upper entry level to mid-tier heritage military themed watch space. This is a dive watch. Some key characteristics: when you're looking for a diver, of course you're going to want water resistance. Typically there's some type of screw down crown. You're going to want something that's tough, legible with a dive time bezel, and a diver extension is always nice if on bracelets. This is their combat sub 42 Quartz model, and it's a Quartz version of their popular automatic combat subline. Now even more affordable, of course, with that Quartz movement, kind of replacing the very popular mechanical automatic movement. This watch was actually lent in by Montreux straps for this special sponsored segment. So this episode is actually sponsored by the team at Montreux because they recently released the 22mm version of their very popular FKM rubber straps, which you guys have seen featured here on the channel before. So we're going to actually be featuring this Glycine on their 22mm strap. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get these pieces in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, another big shout out to Montreux Straps, of course, for sponsoring this episode. And if you haven't ever unboxed a Montreux strap, here's what the experience is like. Very clean layout here. Some people will mention that this is very reminiscent of the Monopoly game in terms of the kind of white and red layout. But one of the nice things is you do have this really cool case, which actually does have magnetic snaps that aren't super strong magnets, but strong enough to hold this, not strong enough to damage your watch or magnetize your spring bars or anything like that. And then you have what you see here, guys, which is their new 22mm lug width option, which is pretty darn nice. And you guys know I've reviewed these on the channel before, so I definitely feel comfortable sharing them with you guys again now at a larger size. They're very, very thin, which is what makes them very, very different. Because they are quite thin, it makes them very, very comfortable, very, very pliable, but they also still at the same time manage to feel quite supple and quite plush, so it doesn't feel like a cheap strap, although they're not super expensive at just $45. You also are getting quick release spring bars there, nicely signed, and just really well contoured and done from that perspective. So again, shout out to Montreux. But with that said, we're going to get into this nice little Glycine here, which these watches have been so popular. I've also reviewed the 39mm size, which I own, but never the full size. And I have to say this full size really reminds me, in terms of its proportions, right off the bat, reminds me a lot of the Omega Seamaster in terms of kind of how it's wider, only slightly. This isn't a huge watch at 42mm, but in terms of that bigger dial, bigger bezel, very thin, flat profile. I mean, it does, of course, taper down in terms of the lugs. They do have a nice downturn shape to them. But overall, this thing really, really hugs the wrist, and the thinness is what really, really shines when it comes to this timepiece. So in terms of the dimensions, 42mm in diameter, only 10.7mm thick, guys, 50mm lug to lug. And again, these lugs do turn down quite nicely. So even at that larger lug to lug, this is going to probably fit a lot of, I'd say, a wider array of wrists than your typical, let's say if these were pretty flat lugs at 50mm, and let's say it was like lifting off. But you can see here, especially with the addition of this great strap here, it's really, you're able to turn down in terms of really making it hug a smaller silhouette. Now, getting into some other specs here, this dial is really nicely done, and it's underneath a beautiful sapphire crystal, which does have an inner AR coating, and you can see a nice cyclops, which does its job magnifying the date. Check out the 30 there. Versus here, if you look at it, it's much smaller. So it's actually doing its job. It's not there to be ornamental. It's a functional, fully functional cyclops, which I think is very nice. Now, in terms of the bezel action, very nice, actually. Check that out. I mean, maybe a slight bit of play, but it is a 60, 60 click bezel, and it's not a, Tudor 60 click, which is a great 60 click bezel. But it's still nice, and it's definitely very functional, feels very robust, has nice clicks, audibly nice, tactile nice. Maybe a little bit if you want to try to rock it, but still, even then, for a 60 click bezel, this is actually pretty nice. And yeah, unidirectional, so it's only going to go the one direction, like a traditional dive time bezel. It does have also a coated aluminum insert that is actually bicolor, so you're going to see black on top, gray on the bottom. It might be hard to pick up on the camera, but I think that's pretty cool, because with the gray dial, it really just kind of sets this thing off. And honestly, you guys can see the AR coating there has a bit of a blue hue to it. So if you did want to pair this with a navy blue strap, like the one we saw in the intro from Montreux, that still works too. But I think the black, kind of black on gray, monotone look looks very cool. And I like that they added a little bit of contrast without it just being super plain. Now, although you can't see it, this is going to be using a Quartz Ronda caliber 715, which actually has a 5-year battery life. So pretty nice. Case back is solid, embossed, of course, with the nice, etched setup with, of course, also showing you some of the specs here. So 20 atmospheres, I believe these in the 39 were actually upgraded to 300 meters, if I recall correctly, and these ones are still 20, which is totally fine. It's all you ever really need, especially when you consider how thin this case profile is. Now, getting into the dial, of course, this is actually going to be a lot more, I'd say, vanilla in terms of its execution. It's a very standard kind of maxi, Submariner style dial. Typically, they'd like to integrate some military, kind of field watch dial nuances. In terms of the design, a lot of the times you're going to see a lot more numerals here. With this Quartz version, it's much cleaner. And you know what? I'm not mad at that. I think there's plenty of people that probably would prefer this look and don't mind, it looking a little bit more like a Submariner versus its own kind of individual combat sub DNA. Now, especially if you already own a combat sub, right, with a mechanical movement, if you do want to kind of shake things up and have a beater that's always kind of, always going to be ready for you, then something like this is really going to probably resonate more so than just another version of something that already exists. So I do also appreciate the fact that they, went the extra mile and to give you something, again, that is slightly different from that front as well. Now, you're getting this really cool glossy gray dial. You're also getting, of course, you can see the date at 3 o'clock, and you're also going to notice, guys, this thing is really nicely beveled. Look at that date window, especially under magnification. But even not under magnification, you can still see that, yeah, they went the extra mile, added some details, so I can really appreciate that. You're going to see polished hands and loom. I do like that the hour hand, that circular portion on there, which is essentially kind of the old lollipop style, that Tudor would use back in the day. Where they may forego, of course, your typical Mercedes. It's cool that it's actually like pretty much the exact same size as the circular markers for the hours. So that's a really nice kind of proportional little detail there that I definitely enjoy. Also, Superluminova here. It doesn't say which particular, at least from what I could find online, which particular formula of Superluminova. I'm going to guess probably C1 does glow green, but it also does render quite white in daylight situations versus like if this was a C3, you're going to have like a couple tints of green even in the daylight. So, yeah, we'll see how it does in the dark. But first, let's actually get it on the wrist and see how it wears. Okay, as you guys can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, this thing wears really, really beautifully. Of course, this is a full-size diver at 42 millimeters, but definitely nowhere near oversized, especially with that very, very thin profile. That silhouette really helps us just wrap around the wrist. Of course, if I get my wrist a bit too close to the camera lens, you're going to get some perspective distortion. It's going to make the watch feel a lot larger, right? Kind of that fisheye aspect to it. So if I keep my wrist nice and low though, and then just tighten up the frame, you're actually going to be able to see a bit more of a detailed look, right? Just without as much of that potential distortion. So check that out. You can see very nicely centered on my wrist. And yeah, although my wrist is on the larger side of average at 7.5 inches, one thing I will say is, look, it's pretty round. It's a pretty tall wrist. So it's not like it's super flat and wide and accommodating. So I do have to, of course, consider things like lug to lug, and then, you know, always playing with proportions, not just scale, right? And I think the dial to bezel ratio on here looks really great. It looks really balanced, nicely done. Again, that flat sapphire and this just overall really flat aesthetic. It's really cool. I mean, it's hard to find something like this. Again, this reminds me most of my Omega Seamaster 300 Professional, and those are notoriously thin watches, and they definitely cost a lot more than this, especially in its you know, in this particular trim, where you can get these I like $200 from dealers. Like, that's pretty wild. Of course, the full MSRP I think is 750 Swiss francs, but I mean, in the vein of unfortunately their new brand owners, Invicta, you know, there's the list price and then there's the price that they actually sell for, right? So around $200. You can even find it under $200 most of the time. So I think that's pretty darn good, especially if you're in need for something that's just, you know, a nice watch that you can just wear it at any time. And not everybody's into mechanical timepieces. So it's nice to see, of course, a thin watch. I mean, it was thin with the mechanical automatic movement, but you can definitely guarantee that it makes sense to have a mechanical, I mean, I should say a quartz watch that's thin as well. And you can't always find a thin quartz diver. So, ooh. This one's pretty cool, guys. So with that said, let's actually get it off the wrist, set up for some lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. All right, as you guys can see, very nice lume. I mean, nothing crazy, but the good news is these are, you know, that's the maxi style dial, so it's nice and wide. So there's going to be a wide surface there, even if it's not super thickly applied. And again, this is the very much the budget version. You know, again, under $200 typically for the street price. Now, getting into a low light transition, you know, it's always nice to see what this watch is going to render like in less than optimal lighting, because you're always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it's nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. And you guys can see there's actually quite a bit of play to that bezel insert. It is aluminum and it is coated, but it's also brushed. So you can see it plays with the light quite nicely. And that dial, although quite flat, the nice thing is it's always rendering very high contrast, whether it be, you know, dim or bright. You're gonna pretty much be able to see, you know, and have really nice orientation thanks to that big triangle at 12. So very cool. Whew, nice. All right, guys, so closing thoughts. Nice and thin on the wrist, lays very flat. Of course, the proportions are definitely reminiscent of the Omega Seamaster Professional. And then the thin FKM strap, really just, it's a great pairing. Thin straps, thin watch. And then with the fact that they're using a quartz caliber in here means that it can really be quite grab and go, which I like. In terms of model variants, I mean, these are available in 36 millimeters, 39 millimeters, 42 millimeters, 46 millimeters, and even 48 millimeter variants. Thanks, Invicta. But all honestly, you know, I'm most interested in, of course, the 39 millimeter variant. That's the one that I own, and I think that's great. Unfortunately, they're very hard to find, especially at a discounted rate. Now, the 42 millimeter ones are going to be a little bit more abundant, and then the 36 millimeters after that, you can kind of find them. The really large ones, you seem to be able to find those ones everywhere, especially highly discounted. But I will say, after experiencing the 42 millimeter in the flesh, I'm not opposed to it. Like, if I could find one that aesthetically had the design that I like, I might check it out. My thing is, you know, I do like a 20 millimeter lug width, which the nice thing is for Montreux straps, they make 20. That was like their first size they came out with. But the cool thing is if you like a wider you know, stance and whatnot on your watch, or you wear larger watches, then 22 millimeters is going to be perfect for you. So in terms of comparable models, you know, it's definitely a mashup of the Rolex Submariner design cues mixed with the Omega SMP 300 proportions. And I think that's a pretty nice mix, especially when I don't think too many people are going to confuse us with either of those watches. The proportions make it clearly not a Rolex. And then, of course, the design aesthetic make it clearly not a Seamaster. So those are all good things. So for me, guys, bottom line is the Combat Sub is definitely known for its strong value proposition and rugged good looks. Now, the Quartz variations really offer a more toned down, almost borderline semi-generic design aesthetic that feels extra unoffensive. So, you know, if there were those little design cues that maybe were holding you back from some of the more mainstream Glycine combat subs, I have to say here, when you're considering how much cheaper it's going to be, and then you add into that, you know, this design aesthetic, which to many, you know, they might feel that this more uncluttered variation could be aesthetically more pleasing to their eyes. So who knows? Let me know what you all think down in the comments below. And again, a huge shout out and thank you to Montreux Straps for sponsoring this episode. Definitely check out the links down in the description. If you want to look at some of their strap offerings, I'll also leave links to the actual video reviews and whatnot that I've done and features of them in the past. So with that said, let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do a like, and if you're not already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.